So verbal commands or hand commands? Have you ever considered why dog trainers might use one or the other in their training? I'm Zach Kaiser with American Dog Pros, and today's episode is hand commands versus verbal commands. So verbal cues or hand commands? What's the difference? Why, when, how are we going to use these things? Let's get into it. First of all, a lot of people don't understand that verbal cues are not easily learned by dogs, and hand commands or body language cues are learned easily. A lot of people think hand commands for dogs, but a lot of times I would put that into a broader category of body language cues. And for me, I teach a lot of body language cues, and sometimes I will then graduate to a verbal cue with those commands. It is very important to understand that dogs learn body language first, and if you are not going through a specific sequence to make sure that they learn verbal cues beyond their body language cues or hand signals, they're not going to. So a lot of people, I see pet owners every day, they're telling their dog sit while they're picking their hand up. If you're doing those two actions at the same time, the dog is only responding to the body language cue or the hand signal. They're not even learning the verbal cue at all. And this is very easy to test, and I've done it a lot of times with pet owners that believe that their dog has learned the word sit or down. If you don't do any kind of hand signals and just ask your dog sit or ask your dog down, for most pet owners, that's not going to happen. The dog is responding specifically to these body language cues because that's their first language. And so if we want to take something that is on a body language cue or a hand signal and move it to a verbal cue, what we would have to do is put that verbal cue distinctly before the body language cue occurs, and then when the behavior happens, then the consequence, the reward, would occur after that. And so it's a sequence that follows what we call the behavior cycle. There is a cue, a behavior, and then a consequence, which is in a lot of cases a reward when we're teaching a new behavior. So that's how the behavior cycle works to create cues. Now, when we teach puppies to sit, we're often picking our hand up. The puppy looks up and sits because the looking up action causes dogs to sit, and then we give the reward, and that cycle occurs. If we want to add a new cue, which is going to be the word sit, we would put that cue directly before the first cue in that cycle. So we would say sit, then we would pick our hand up, the dog would sit, and then we would give the consequence, which is the reward, and that would lead to the dog learning that new cue, which is the verbal cue sit. And we can make that cue whatever we want. We can make it sit, we can make it a new hand command, we can make it a different word, aussi in French, we can do different languages. It doesn't really matter as long as that new cue is coming before the previous cue, and then the dog's behavior, and then the consequence, the reward, is occurring at the end of that cycle. That's how that occurs. Now, I think that both verbal cues and hand signals are very important, and with my pets I teach all hand signals and body language cues first because obviously the dog learns that naturally and very easily, and then once the dog has learned these things and I can prompt them easily, I will add the verbal cues after to ensure that they, and I'll go through a lengthy generalization process to ensure that they understand that verbal cue without the hand signal. Then you'll have both. You'll now have two commands for giving to your dog asking for a behavior. So you can say sit, or you could lift up your hand. You wouldn't generally do both. You could do one or the other. Now, another thing that a lot of people talk about is repeating verbal commands. I don't generally, and try not to as much as possible, repeat verbal commands. This is one of the big errors that I see with pet owners is they're sit, 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 sit. They're saying sit all the time. And so what we want to do is we want to, if I was going to say I asked my dog for sit and he doesn't respond, the next thing that would happen was I would then give the body language cue that they understand so I can help them with something they're even more familiar with, and hoping that that would then create the behavior I want, and then the consequence will come at the end. That's a very efficient way of training. And so that's what I would invoke you to do with your training, is to use, once your dog has learned a body language cue very well, then you would add the sit or the verbal if your dog's learned the body language cue very well, then you could add the verbal command in and start using it. But if they don't listen or respond to that right away, then we could give the body language or hand signal right after that. Now, some behaviors that I teach, I never add a verbal command at all. So my dog sits pretty, Scrappy, you may have seen some of his videos. I just put my hand up for that. I never ask for a verbal command. I've never taught a verbal command for that behavior because I haven't seen it as necessary. I can always just give them my hand. And behaviors that are happening at a distance, a lot of times, if the dog is stationary at a distance, I'll a lot of times just use a hand command because it's easy. If they're looking at me, they can see it, and I don't have to shout out to them for them to hear it. Also, a lot of times with directionals, if I teach my dogs to go different directions, left and right, off of hand commands, and sometimes I don't add a verbal command to that ever. So it just depends on what your behavior is. My main point in this article is that both are very valuable. One is not better than the other. Verbal commands are more difficult to obtain, and that's why most of your high-end competitions require you to only have verbal commands. You're not allowed to give any body language cues or hand signals in addition to your verbal cues because that's a test of difficulty. They're more difficult to obtain. So getting your dog on verbal only is a test of adequacy and training. The body language cues come more easily and more naturally to the dogs. Start with teaching body language. That's why you see a lot of good dog trainers aren't using verbal commands with puppies until the dog has nailed down the behaviors and they're very predictable. And then once you get that predictability, then you can add your verbal commands in, and you can get that verbal command quickly and efficiently, and then your dog will be transferred to that. So that's all I have to say on this. Drop your questions and comments in the section below. We'd love to answer them and see your feedback. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Zach with American Dog Pros, and have a great day.